we are going to be having, I believe it is Robert, on the bottom of your screen, with that team of Tapu Koko, Kartana, Tapu Fini, Arcanine, Porygon 2, and Gigalith, that Flavor of the Month team, going against Nick's very specific to himself team of Arcanine, Clefairy, Kartana, Salamence, Snorlax, and Tapu Bulu. It has been a team that has served him well so far.
Right, and as you say, very specific to himself, and we've talked to a whole bunch of people that, you know, talk to Nick online or in person and say, this is like his team. This is a team that he would run, like, from down to the move set, down to the Pokemon choices. It's very distinctly him, and he's shown in his trip to the finals here that he's made it work for him. And of course he's got a couple niche picks with that Clefairy, with the Tapu Bulu that we've only seen a handful of times, and some really interesting sets throughout his team there. So I think really it's going to be on Robert to kind of respond to the pace of play that Nick is dictating.
It's a really awkward pace as well. There's some
really
days where
is.
he's gone really aggressive, and other days he brings in all those slowing
dude,
down
just
tools.
like you're getting toxic, and you're getting toxic, and then there's some grassy terrain, and then there's a Bloom Doom.
Yeah, that's the weird thing, and he said when I spoke to him yesterday about it, he does have that option, and it's really naughty, just to bring Tapu Bulu and Kartana and start knocking things out really quickly.
Yeah.
So we haven't seen that so much from him. I'm curious to see if it comes to play, especially with this Gigalith. That's going to be one of Robert's lead Pokemon alongside this Tapu Koko, while Nick decides to go with a Snorlax and Arcanine lead combination. The electric terrain uncontested in this matchup, and curiously enough, the weather going to be uncontested again. Nick with no weather setters on this team.
No weather setters at all, so we will be having the sand up for the entirety of this match should Robert choose to have his Gigalith or bring it throughout the set here. And I suspect we're about to see a Volt Switch, which is something that Tapu Koko tend to be inclined to do. Robert is, you know, pretty aware of what's going on with Nick's team at this point. It would likely do well to start whittling down that Snorlax, and as we have seen, it does have thick fat, so its berry is not activating at the 50% mark, but rather at the 25% mark. So if he can set himself up into a position where that Snorlax is sitting around 40% or something like that, then he might be able to knock it out a little bit more easily.
Yeah, it's been very important for him to set up that easy knockout without activating the berry, and it's exactly the same on Nick's Arcanine as well. He has to be very, very careful, I think, how he distributes damage. The Gigalith here, obviously going to be a bit of a threat with that Continental Crush. Does get the Intimidate effect on it though, so it could be important, and with the effects of that Intimidate, decides it's going to leave the field. He's going to bring his own Arcanine, and his own Intimidate comes along with it. That is going to be very useful against both the Snorlax and the Arcanine on Nick's side of the field. As you suggested, Tapu Koko with that Volt Switch on the electric terrain, doing pretty hefty amounts of damage to this Arcanine, bringing it probably to around 65% of its health. And Robert really allowed a free switch to choose what he wants to bring in. He brings that Gigalith right back in. In the words of Nick McCord ever so famously, it is a revolving door of Pokemon, as Arcanine decides to put a Toxic in play on the opposing Arcanine. So Nick showing he's willing to play that slow game if he has to, as Snorlax mitigates the Intimidate immediately by setting up a Curse. Boosting its defense is going to be so useful against both of Robert's Pokemon, and bringing its attack stat to back where it belongs, also exceptionally helpful.
Yeah, so I do like that play a lot by Robert. Volt switching out, getting a nice chip damage onto Arcanine for free, and then bringing that Gigalith back in, as it is in a pretty strong defensive position. The only thing it's really fearing from either of those Pokemon are a high horsepower, which it's able to take from Snorlax at the +0, or a Toxic, or something of that sort from an Arcanine. So he's able to get that Gigalith back into a position where it's more threatening offensively, and it's still not really feeling the pressure from Snorlax just yet, as it is a very bulky Pokemon, taking a non-same attack bonus, high horsepower from that Snorlax. And he does get, Robert does get his Arcanine onto the field, and it takes a Toxics for its troubles, but I think he'll take that Intimidate onto the Snorlax.
Oh yeah, that's very nice. It means that the Curse was not quite as effective as it could have been going into kind of the back of this game. You know, really important to get a good position in these first few turns. This Gigalith as well, probably wanting to get rid of that Arcanine with it at the lower health already. Nick removing the Arcanine though, knowing it might be under threat. Bringing in that Tapu Bulu, going to change up the terrain, bring the grassy terrain to the party, and maybe bring this game to a slightly glacial pace again with those heals. Gigalith protecting itself, maybe a little bit concerned about a high horsepower while it protected. A Flare Blitz though, coming out from this Arcanine, going towards that Tapu Bulu on the switch in, and it is not going to be enough to remove it from play. The Snorlax retaliates with a high horsepower, correctly picking that Arcanine and taking a knockout, but huge damage down on that Tapu Bulu from Robert there. The Sandstorm as well is going to be enough to pick it up, so a trade 1-for-1 in that turn. Nick losing his terrain setter, very important.
Ooh, so these players came to play. Those were two strong reads on both sides. A flare blitzing on Robert's side, that Arcanine side, he was flare blitzing an Arcanine, and in came the Tapu Bulu, so a great read. I think he might have was reading into that a little bit. It was a pretty good position for that Tapu Bulu to think about switching in, and pretty safe outside of that really strong read from Robert. And then Nick retaliates and knocks out that Arcanine and says, well, that was kind of rude. I'm going to hit you with the high horsepower now and just let the Gigalith sit there. And again, Snorlax being faster than the Gigalith is still threatening the high horsepower onto it a turn later, and Gigalith protects into nothing.
Yeah, that was very much a wasted protect. We do see Nick bring the Kartana this game. It is going to be on the grassy terrain, so Leaf Blade's doing more damage, but the grassy terrain immediately removed. It's not the setup he needs. With Tapu Koko now free to switch it around. The item on this Kartana is going to be absolutely essential. Robert, I think, in a strong position to start getting some damage down. Kartana really needs to be pulling its weight here and trying to get knockouts on both Pokemon on, you know, Robert's side of the field. That is definitely a little bit difficult with these big damaging threats. Snorlax, though, still in a great position, still has access to high horsepower, so Tapu Koko might be able to, you know, get knocked out a little bit easier.
Yeah, Snorlax definitely still sitting pretty, and you do mention the item choice on Kartana. We do know that Nails in the past has famously run Scope Lens on his Kartana, which is something that boosts the critical hit ratio and complements Kartana really well because it already has its signature move of sorts, Leaf Blade, and boosts the critical hit chance from 25 to 50%, so he has a 50% chance to do a lot of damage into just about anything.
Yeah, he's not going to flip that coin this turn though, as Kartana decides to detect Snorlax taking a lot of damage from that Tapu Koko as it Volt Switches out once more. The next bit of play is going to be so important. The Porygon 2 replacing Tapu Koko, so we've now seen all of Robert's team. This Snorlax could be under danger. If we see there's something like a Continental Crush, it could be in trouble. The high horsepower does not connect with that Porygon 2, as there is going to be a Continental Crush. The targeting of this so essential for Robert. If he's made a read that the detect was going to happen on this Kartana, it's not even a very effective attack, so it's unlikely it's going that way anyway.
Yeah, and it almost definitely is into the Snorlax. Robert trying to get some damage down, like we mentioned, so that he doesn't have to deal with that berry in the end game. And it's going to do an okay amount of, a lot of damage actually, and Snorlax is brought down to its 25%. I thought that with the defense boost that he had from the curse, that might not do so much damage. That Snorlax didn't enjoy that Continental Crush too much at all.
No, but he does get to activate the berry, and actually still very healthy as we play out this turn. I think the Porygon's an interesting addition here. Both these Pokemon on Robert's side of the field weak to a potential Sacred Sword from Kartana. That's going to maybe slow his play down a little bit, but Porygon is a decent answer. We know that a lot of them carry Ice Beam. That might be an option for getting good damage down, relying on the grass typing, only a normal type hit. The Gigalith falling short on that Snorlax, though, I think puts the momentum somewhat in Nick's favor here.
Alright, and I'm sure he would have loved to get that high horsepower up because, you know, depending on the damage roll there, how much he was able to tag that Porygon 2 with on the switch-in might have put it into KO range for Kartana, whether it be with the Sacred Sword or with a critical hit Leaf Blade. So definitely unfortunate for Nick there, missing out on that 5% chance to miss the high horsepower.
Well, Leaf Blade is going to go straight towards that Gigalith. Not enough for the knockout, as Porygon 2 goes for a Thunderbolt immediately in return. Is going to bring the Snorlax down very low again, as Snorlax sets up another curse in this instance, lowering its speed, making sure it's slower than the Gigalith in future, I believe, as Gigalith goes for a Stone Edge, which misses that Snorlax, so not able to knock it out.
A bit of a greedy curse there. I think Nick was pretty certain he was going to get the KO with that Leaf Blade there. Otherwise, I don't think he really had a reason to curse at all. He knows that he's not particularly threatened by Porygon 2 with Snorlax, and it's very high HP and high special defense stat. That Gigalith is still threatening, as we just saw the amount of damage that Continental Crush did in the prior turn, despite Snorlax already being at +1 defense. So that curse maybe would have been a little bit better had he been able to pick up the Gigalith here, but now he's threatened with a KO from Thunderbolt.
Well, yeah, he is threatened by that, but the Kartana's caught in two minds of what it's going to target. Likely just going to remove the Gigalith from play, but if there's a Detect, something like that, you know, a Protect on the Gigalith, that could really throw a spanner in the works. So I think Robert is the one making those tough decisions in this turn. Nick, though, trying to boost his Snorlax up in any way possible. He is a little bit limited in the options, but the Pokemon count at 3-3, I think the advantage lies somewhat with Nick, as we do see him start the turn with a Sacred Sword, going to target Porygon and not get the knockout, nowhere near. Snorlax falling down to a Thunderbolt in the electric terrain as Gigalith goes for a Stone Edge. Going to target that Kartana, not do too much damage, but importantly, maybe bring it in range of something like a Thunderbolt. The Sandstorm subsides. Gigalith will have to switch out if it's relying on that move in future, but Arcanine takes to the field for Nick here.
And I think Nick, if he was a betting man, would have said, yeah, the Gigalith is probably protecting that turn. But Robert does see through that a little bit and is able to get a good amount of damage off onto that Kartana, despite the fact that it is a little bit of a, well, it is a resisted hit, and it does have a high defense stat, so a good amount of damage coming out from Gigalith, and Nick probably has to think about getting that Gigalith gone pretty soon here, and he is in position to do so. But should he choose to target that Gigalith here, he is subject to an Ice Beam coming out of Porygon 2.
Yeah, that's going to be a big problem. Porygon 2, I think, in a fairly solid position overall. Again, he has to worry about activating that Mago Berry on Arcanine, but if Arcanine goes for a Flare Blitz on the Porygon 2, doesn't get the knockout, it could become a very interesting situation. We do see a very long turn time taken by Robert, really wanting to make sure he makes the right calls and maybe bluff another one of those protects on the Gigalith to surprisingly keep it around for longer. It looks like it's a dead cert to protect, but wasn't last time. This time he doesn't even try it. The Leaf Blade will connect with a critical hit thanks to potentially the item there. The Beast Boost could become a real problem now. This Kartana raising its already sky-high attack. Flare Blitz following up from this Arcanine. Going to go for Porygon 2. Not get the knockout, a little bit of recoil damage in exchange, as Porygon 2 does go for an Ice Beam. He's going to connect with Kartana and do enough for the knockout here. That's so important. Immediately removing it from play after the Beast Boost. So now, with the last Pokemon coming out from Robert here, it looks like he's in a very solid position.
Yeah, it looks like he's just about got it with this full health Tapu Koko taking the field here, and is threatening electric terrain damage onto Arcanine. Although I think this might be the last turn of the electric terrain, which kind of changes with some of the damage rolls a little bit. But I don't see any reason that with a 2v1, Robert not being able to take this in the end game.
We know that Flare Blitz has to come in from this Arcanine. We do see him go for a Volt Switch, which is very, very curious. Doesn't quite get the knockout, maybe showing that he's lacking a more powerful electric type attack. As Arcanine free to retaliate with the Flare Blitz, and is going to target down that Porygon 2 and secure the knockout on it. So this could be becoming very, very close if, as you say, the electric terrain is running out this turn. This gets a little bit closer, in my opinion.
Okay, so coming down to the wire here, this Arcanine needs to do enough with the Flare Blitz to be able to pick up the KO the next turn with an extreme speed. And if Tapu Koko is able to hang on from the Flare Blitz and with enough HP, but actually the Toxic is going to come out.
That's a very curious play from the Arcanine on Nick's side of the field. Maybe we see him very confident in the amount of damage this Volt Switch has been doing. He may be confident he can take one more. You look at the way this turn's going to go. If he believes he can take one more, he protects this turn, gets some Toxic tick damage. Then he takes another Volt Switch, then protects again, and then he may be able to do it. If he doesn't protect it or, go for something in that turn, he may just feel very, very comfortable in his ability to play out this end game.
Right, and I think even just based on how his Arcanine is trained, he may know that 3 turns of Toxic damage is more than 1 turn of extreme speed damage.
Yeah, that's very, very important. So this turn, he's able to get some damage down, and then I think he's going to rely on this poison building up. As we see extreme speed, the damage this Volt Switch does is so important. It's going to go for Arcanine. It is going to fall short of the knockout. So it hangs on with a sliver, an absolute pittance of health on that Arcanine. The Tapu Koko here just doesn't have enough gas in the tank as Arcanine protects itself. Another turn of Toxic damage coming out. Tapu Koko in vain goes for the Volt Switch here. The Toxic damage ticking up. Will this be enough? It is not. But Arcanine, with extreme speed in its move pool, will be able to tidy up this game with a knockout on the Tapu Koko. There it is. Nick really looking up against it, found a win condition with his Arcanine, and while many people wonder how you fit Toxic on an Arcanine, that's why you fit Toxic on an Arcanine.
That's an unbelievable management at the end. We had written it off. We were like, oh, no, Arcanine is done. But like we mentioned prior to the game starting, we said, you know, this is a distinctly Nick team. He knows exactly how much damage he needs to do with that Toxic, how much it's going to do over the course of the 4 or 5 turns that Arcanine ended up being on the... And he knows exactly how much damage that he's going to take from that Volt Switch. He down to that little tiny sliver of red health, he had his end game planned out with that Arcanine perfectly.
Well, the big thing to know about the Tapu Koko was its most offensive attack, and the best attack you could think to use in that moment was the Volt Switch. So maybe giving Nick, if he didn't have it already, good information on that team build and really the amount of damage he could do. Something like a Thunderbolt, handcrafted Nick Navarre only team of Arcanine, Clefairy, Kartana, Salamence, Snorlax, and Tapu Bulu.
And, you know, I think Robert played that game really, really well. You know, some of the games that we've had Nick on for, he has been dictating the pace of play. He's had everything locked down. He's looked almost dominant at some points with the safe switches, predicting targets, you know, keeping that Snorlax into such a good position that it's able to clean up end games. But Robert played that really well, I thought. Probably one of the best attempts at Nick's team that I've seen this weekend. Making sure that he had that Tapu Koko, a big damage threat on his team, waiting in the back and managing the early game around with his Gigalith and the Porygon and the Arcanine.
Yeah, very good endgame management there. And picking the right targets is so important. It's super treacherous when you've got the Flare Blitz in play that you're obviously doing damage to yourself. But we see how important, as we saw in the semi-finals, that Mago Berry is on that Arcanine. It gives you so much longevity because it seems like he never fails to activate it in a game. Players just aren't really willing or ready to set themselves up to get around that.
Right, and just management, like just at the last endgame, we talked about how he managed that little sliver of health and the tiny bits of damage that was being done by Toxic, and he's managing those little bits of health to make sure that, like you said, the Mago activates on the Doggo, and that even the Berry activates on his Snorlax, which he's opted out of using Gluttony on.
Yeah, that's something that's so important for his management here. The leads have taken the field. It's a bit of a change-up. The Kartana and Arcanine from Nick are going to be staring down the Tapu Koko and Gigalith from Robert. I think this is a fantastic position for Nick. Of course, the Gigalith is quite comfortable to take a Leaf Blade, but I do think that Kartana is in a great position to start dealing big damage. I can't see any direct threats to it unless Tapu Koko has something in that kind of build. It is a very curious moveset, and I'd be interested to see what Robert pulls out with it.
Right, and Tapu Koko does tend, when it runs something like a Life Orb or the Choice Specs that we've seen, does threaten a Kartana with the KO with just a Thunderbolt, but we've seen that Tapu Koko's not running Thunderbolt, and it's not running a boosting item either, so Kartana probably pretty comfortable outside of maybe a tech that Tapu Koko is running. As far as Robert's concerned, I would be looking to see something a lot like what he did in turn 1 of game 1 with a Volt Switch, perhaps getting that Gigalith in, Gigalith out, the Arcanine in, and the Gigalith back into the other slot. But of course, Nails is intimately aware of what happened in turn 1 in game 1.
Oh yeah, he's very smart. That Gigalith being intimidated is such a help. The Arcanine leaving the field, saving that Intimidate for later. Tapu Bulu coming to the party, going to be bringing the Grassy Surge with him, so if he was going for a Volt Switch, the damage output of that is severely limited. Gigalith also leaving the field could be the same kind of play as we saw before, as Tapu Fini takes the field, immediately replacing that grassy terrain with the misty terrain, so that Tapu Bulu isn't going to be able to capitalize off this, as Kartana may be a little bit worried about what's going to happen. Goes with the Detect, as Tapu Koko reveals Hidden Power. It targets that Kartana, maybe giving away exactly what Hidden Power type it is.
And I'm pretty certain that's Hidden Power Fire, and Kartana with, I believe it's a base 31 special defense stat, is worse than some Pokemon that you might encounter on Route 1 in a given Pokemon game. So Kartana, regardless of the low base power of Hidden Power, is going to drop to a Hidden Power Fire from Tapu Koko 100% of the time in this scenario here.
There's no doubt about it, but Tapu Bulu coming to the field, I think, very, very helpful. That grass type attack, even without grassy terrain, makes Tapu Fini's life a bit of a hard time, and Kartana, if it is able to stick around, then it may be able to get off a big attack of its own. So the Tapu Bulu, I think, is going to be the key focus here for Nick, even without its grassy terrain in play.
Right, and I do think Robert is pretty forced to switch in Arcanine here with 2 grass types on the field. But how he manages those 2 slots, whether or not he wants to, I mean, because nothing outside of the Arcanine wants to take that grass attack. So if he chooses which slot that Arcanine comes into incorrectly, something is going to take a lot of damage.
Yeah, well, the Kartana, knowing the threat of that hidden power, does decide to leave the field as the thick fat Snorlax coming in. The pittance of damage it took, maybe a dead giveaway on that hidden power fire. If you needed any further confirmation at home, Tapu Bulu taking his time to activate the Bloom Doom. The target on this is going to be so essential. It doesn't have the grassy terrain, but it's going to do a lot of damage.
It's going to do a lot of damage to whatever it targets, and it is going to be the Tapu Fini. And everybody say goodbye to Tapu Fini because that is a big, big attack that's coming out of Tapu Bulu.
There's no way to avoid it. Nick was really in two minds there, you know, maybe go for the Tapu Koko, but he probably doesn't feel too worried about the Tapu Koko at all. Now he's pretty much dealt with it. It is the fastest thing on the field, but we saw it do, you know, I think it's fair to say, limited amounts of damage due to its build, so if it's not hitting super effectively, if it doesn't have control of the terrain, I think he's not so worried about the Tapu Koko, and he's going to start focusing other things down. Both these Pokemon on the field are weak to ground types, and Snorlax might be able to capitalize.
Yeah, I think this is a great time for Snorlax to start thinking about setting up here if it wants to use a curse, probably. Robert is in a position where he is sort of forced to play a little bit more passively. He's a little bit on the back foot now, and that might be a good opportunity, a good window for Nick to try and get some curses up so that Snorlax is a little bit more effective against that Gigalith that's waiting in the back.
Yeah, that's really, really important. I think all three of the Pokemon remaining on Robert's side of the field are actually weak to ground. So if this Snorlax, we do know, of course, it carries that high horsepower. If it can get set up to use those with the curses, it's going to be in a great position.
It's going to be in a phenomenal position. One curse will probably do it, but if it can get two even
it does
better.
Have to compensate for the Intimidate.
It does. But it does still have that Figgy Berry, I believe, waiting in the wings, and of course it will have to get down to 25%. But the only big damage threat that Robert has on the field, not even on the field, left, is his Gigalith, the Stone Edge, and perhaps the Continental Crush.
Well, that Tapu Bulu maybe wanted to get its terrain back when it comes back later. Gets an Intimidate now by switching in the Arcanine. Going to be effective on Robert's Arcanine. Both of Nick's Pokemon actually leaving the field right now as Kartana comes in place of that Snorlax. Skydrop coming out from this Tapu Koko. It is going to be lifting the Pokemon into the sky on Nick's side, the Arcanine in this case, as after the Misty Seed, he reveals the Kartana's scope lens by thieving it away. That could be essential. If Arcanine's able to capitalize on it, get some critical hits of its own, this could be a very different game, but it appears to me Nick kind of wants Kartana to go down almost.
It does. It seems like it was a little bit of a curious switch. He might have deemed it maybe the least essential Pokemon to the management of his end game here. And he is, you know, willing to give up the potential for his scope lens, but I think that that switch in the Kartana for Kartana in for the Snorlax was mostly because he values Kartana's item less than he values Snorlax's item. That berry is critical for the end game management.
Yeah, we saw that actually in previous games, that switching into Thief is so useful, and when you give them a dud of an item, they're really stuck with it for the rest of the game, and they're not able to just start picking things off unless you activate their item for them, which is pretty much something they're not going to do, especially something like a scope lens you can't get rid of. Well, we are going to see Snorlax take place at that Kartana, maybe just giving it up for the item, nothing more. Arcanine being freed from the Skydrop, taking minimal damage. A Flare Blitz now coming out from this Arcanine. Going to target the Arcanine slot here. Not very effective, taking a little bit in recoil, of course, as Arcanine retaliates with a Flare Blitz of his own. This time could be very important. A little more effective against a Tapu Koko in this instance, of course, taking more damage in recoil as the Sandstorm starts to wear away. This Tapu Koko going to be clinging on here. This Sandstorm so annoying to deal with, as every Pokemon on the field taking that damage. I think Nick making a smart switch with that Snorlax.
Yeah, Snorlax more than happy to retake the field now that its item is no longer in jeopardy. And like we talked about before it switched out, it was in a pretty good position defensively, not really fearing Tapu Koko, not really feeling the damage threat from Arcanine, but it was fearing losing its berry. And now that that's not on the table, as Robert's Arcanine is sporting a nice scope lens, Snorlax is a little bit safer on the field here.
Yeah, it's in a really good position. Arcanine trying to remove that Tapu Koko from play with an extreme speed, but it is no longer the Tapu Koko, it is now the Gigalith. Arcanine carrying on the trend of these Flare Blitzes, this time going towards that Snorlax, an absolute measly amount of damage because of that thick fat, as Snorlax returns the favour with a high horsepower into its friend slot, this Gigalith, going to be able to easily pick up this two-hit knockout, as both the mist and the sand disappear, so this Gigalith coming in, not able to reset the sand. Nick looking in a very commanding position. All his Pokemon still in play. He's got a better item on his Arcanine, and he has pretty much an opportunity to control the weather a little bit easier later in the game.
Right, and catching that Gigalith on the switch-in was brilliant with that high horsepower. He double targeted that Tapu Koko slot. He said, you know, if Tapu Koko stays in, it's going to lose to an extreme speed, and then I'm going to redirect that high horsepower on the Arcanine. But should he switch out, I'm going to catch your Gigalith, and Snorlax is faster than the Gigalith and is now threatening it with a 2-hit KO from that high horsepower.
Yeah, the Arcanine as well on Nick's side, on Robert's side of the field, isn't going to be able to do enough. That thick fight is showing why it's so important. While Gluttony has been the ability of choice, I think with the presence of Arcanine consistently throughout this season, it seems to be such a useful ability. Arcanine just stuck Flare Blitzing into a Arcanine on Nick's side of the field, taking his recoil, actually activating the Mago Berry on Nick's Arcanine. That's going to be a very healthy doggo indeed, as he decides to Toxic. It's going to be targeting Robert's Arcanine. That's going to start wearing it down, and we know he doesn't have the berry, so maybe looking for a similar endgame to before. The faster Snorlax with the high horsepower connects with the Gigalith and takes the knockout. It looks like Nick is going to break that top 4 curse, and he's in such a commanding position to win this final.
It is looking dire for Robert at this point. He has no way that he can effectively damage that Snorlax, and I think what he might have been better served doing these past 2 turns was Flare Blitzing the Snorlax and just hoping for a burn. That might have been that 10% chance from the Flare Blitz might have been his out, because Snorlax is effectively unstoppable right now. We know that Tapu Koko is not running Protect. It'll drop down to an extreme speed, and then it's going to be a 4 vs 1 with Arcanine against all of Nails' Pokemon.
It's really tough. I don't think there's any real way for this to happen. And with the Toxics in play, he knows how to play out these end games. There's no way for this Arcanine to be doing consistent damage, as Arcanine on Robert's side goes to the extreme speed, doesn't get anywhere near enough damage, as Nick responds with an extreme speed, gets that Tapu Koko knocked out very comfortably. Looks like Snorlax is going to have the final say here in the Masters Finals at Virginia Regionals, as it does take the knockout on this Arcanine. Nick Navarre, your Masters Division Regional Champion here in Roanoke, Virginia.
Unbelievable match there, and really Nick just played clinically in top 4 in the finals here, playing that team